Fred West was born on September 29th, 1941. He was one of 7 children. Now, many neighbors and friends after the fact came out and said that they do remember Fred and his mother having a inappropriate relationship, and that they were very close, so close that it made them uncomfortable at times. And then we find out later when Fred is being interviewed and it's coming up on his case that he was indeed sexually abused by his mother. He refused to call it sexual abuse. It was an incestuous sexual relationship, but he, to the very end, said that it was completely normal. There was nothing wrong with what they did, and that was his mother showing him how much he loved him. So we're gonna start by putting Fred right here. Excuse the sad elementary type drawing. Fred also went on to share that the only case of incest that was going on in his family was not just that was going on with him and his mother, but that his father also had incestuous sexual relationships with Fred's sisters, his father's daughters. In the West household, it was very heavily emphasized that everything that was going on in the house was completely normal. Fred's mother is having a sexual relationship with him. Fred's father is having sexual relationships with his daughters, and they reiterate over and over, this is completely normal. This is what loving parents do to their children. This is how we show love and affection. There's nothing wrong with what is happening here. The other siblings later on, namely Fred's brother, said that their scope of what was normal parent-child relations was so skewed because this was all they knew. And not only was it all they knew, it was something that was forced down their throats, and they were continuously brainwashed into thinking that this is what everyone does. It came out that Fred was having a sexual relationship with his sister when he was 15. She was 13. Fred got his biological sister pregnant. Fred and his brothers shared similar stories about how when they were very young boys, under the age of 8 to 10, it varies by the brother, that their father would take them to the barn as a sort of rite of passage, and show them how to have intercourse with a sheep that they owned. And then after showing them how to do it, he made them do it and watched. Now to talk about Rose a little bit. Rose was born Rosemary Letts on November 29th, 1953. Rose was born into unfortunate circumstances on several different levels. Both her parents were incredibly mentally ill adults. I found out from multiple resources that Rosemary's mother underwent electroshock therapy while she was pregnant with Rosemary. More than once, several times throughout the pregnancy, she did electroshock therapy. Rose's mother's name was Daisy. She suffered from severe depression. And Rose's father, William, but he went by Bill, he was an incredibly violent man, and he was also a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. Rose's father was always abusive to Rose's mother. She witnessed this her entire life, and then at a certain point, he started becoming very physically abusive to Rose as well. Unfortunately, this abuse just grew and evolved into sexual abuse. And he would rape Rosemary on a regular basis. Rose, just like Fred, would assert that there was nothing wrong with what her father did to her. She said their relationship was healthy and normal, and Rose and Fred separately both referred to what Rose's father would do to her as making love. So Rose was not known as like slow in school. We don't know what her IQ was the same way we do Fred's, but it seems that it was low. Her nickname was Dozy Rosie in school, and it was because she was, slow. She also really struggled with her weight. She was always a pretty overweight child and teenager, and she endured some really intense bullying for a very long period of time. Again, sorry for the very childlike drawings. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Fred's first wife. It's important because she unfortunately meets a fatal end and has 2 children while she's with Fred. So Fred's first wife was Rena Costello. Fred met Rena in 1962. They also got married in 1962. Now, Rena was pregnant when she met Fred. She was pregnant by her previous boyfriend, who was a Pakistani man. This is important later because Fred used the biracial, the fact that his daughter was biracial to bully her and against her. So for this instance, we'll make mention that Rena's, the man who fathered Rena's child was a Pakistani man. The child, her name was Charmaine. She was born that year, 1962, just a few months after the marriage. Two years after they had been married, after the birth of the first child, Rena gave birth to Fred's biological daughter, Anna Marie. So now Fred's married, there's 2 children in the household, and Fred decides they need a nanny, that Rena needs help. So he hires 16-year-old Anne McFall to be their nanny. So Fred engages in an affair with Anne McFall almost immediately after she becomes their nanny. And then she becomes pregnant. So rather than deal with Anne and an illegitimate child or dealing with the situation with any tact at all, he kills 16-year-old Anne, his unborn child, and buries her in the backyard. Around the same time, Fred was in a terrible car accident. He ran over a 4-year-old little boy. The boy was killed, and at the time there was no suspicion of foul play, that it was intentional, none of that. But Fred was still worried about how he would be perceived by the public. It was a small community, so he decided he needed to move as a result of this accident. And he took the 2 girls, Charmaine and Anna Marie, from Renna, didn't ask her to come, and moved to Gloucester. So it's not long after Fred moves to Gloucester, he meets Rosemary. They actually meet at a bus stop that she would just hang out at, out of boredom or to see people. But this was one of her favorite places to just kind of hang out. They had a really intense connection right away, which is interesting because this happened before either one of them shared anything with the other one about their past or about their experiences. And then once they do, they're so similar. So it is interesting. So Fred decides to use the nanny trick again, which kind of becomes his thing. It did start with Anne, but it does later in the story, it really becomes a thing for Fred. So he's living in Gloucester alone. His wife is not there. He has the 2 girls. So he asks Rose if she would move in with him and be his nanny for the 2 daughters. So Rose moves in with him and starts working for him and helping him with the 2 young girls. They did not engage in a romantic or sexual relationship right away. It was later that they each individually said, oh, there was something there. So when she moves in, they don't know that they are feeling something for each other. She is moving in to do a job. After working him for a little while, they did engage in a sexual relationship, a consensual sexual relationship, and same as with Anne, it didn't take long. Rose was pregnant. So Rose gave birth to their first child together. Her name was Heather Ann. So we're gonna put Fred and Rose as kids over here. So Fred and Rose, the first child is Heather Ann. A few people did, I'm gonna move this over a little bit actually, you can see. A few people did speculate that that Heather Ann might have actually been Bill Letts, his biological daughter. That is, again, that's Rose's father. So there was some speculation, there still is, as far as everything that I found, that there's a possibility that Heather is actually the child of Rose and Rose's father. But as far as Rose or Fred know, this is their first biological child together. So it wasn't long at all after Rose gave birth to Heather Ann. Fred ended up going to prison for a little while. It was about 6.5 months, and it was for stealing car tires. So I'm gonna put just right over here, Fred goes to prison. So again, this was for theft of car tires. It was this period of time is important because according to the three children and what they would say to friends, or even looking back, this is really when Rose, who Rose became, started and where it took place. It was during this time when she was left alone with the three children that she became very cruel, developed a very sadistic nature, a taste for violence, and it just, according to the children, it started kind of out of nowhere, and it got out of control. But it was during the prison sentence that this is where it started to take place. Anna Marie testified during the trial of Rose that Charmaine, which is the child that Rena was already pregnant with when she met Fred, Charmaine is the girl who was biracial. Charmaine endured the most abuse. It was constant physical abuse, verbal abuse. Anne Marie told a story of a time when Rose made young Charmaine undress, get completely nude, tied her to a chair, and just repeatedly just beat the child over and over while she was tied naked to a chair, and then would walk away and leave her there for several hours, come back just to beat her some more. So things between Rose and Charmaine just really escalated. They got worse. It was always out of hand. Any of the abuse that Charmaine endured was horrible, but it just got worse and worse and worse over the 6-month period. I don't know why it was Charmaine that she targeted, but right before Fred was released from prison for the car tire theft, Rosemary murdered Charmaine. So the body wasn't found until years later. When it was, Rose tried to deny any involvement whatsoever. She put the blame 100% on Fred. But because of forensic testing, it was determined that the child was murdered while Fred was still in prison. So there's no way that Fred did it. Anytime that Anne Marie or Heather, neighbors, family, friends would ask where Charmaine was, she would simply tell them that her mother, Charmaine's mother, Rena, had come to take her. She also, Anne Marie says that she was so hurt. The living situation was so bad. It was so abusive. It was a prison. It was a torture home. Was so hurt and confused as to why her mother would come and take Charmaine, her sister, and leave her. And Fred would tell her that she doesn't want you, you're not the color she prefers. So that's why I made mention of Charmaine's race in the beginning. He would, make jokes about Rena and her preference and how she preferred brown men or tan men or children. So Rose, who thought she had all the answers, and could kind of convince Anne Marie and the neighbors and Heather, who was really young, that Charmaine's mother had simply come and picked her up. Well, she hadn't quite planned for what would happen when Charmaine's mother actually did show up for her daughter, or even called to ask questions. So the stories that she would come up with to tell Rena when Rena would call asking about her her two daughters. They didn't set right with Rena. She knew that something was wrong, that something was going on, and she decided that she was tired of getting the runaround. So instead of calling, she drove from the town that she met Fred in Herefordshire to Gloucester and drove to Fred and Rose's house. When she got there, we don't know how, but when she left to drive to the West house, that was the last time she was ever seen. Her body was recovered later in their backyard. So I'll go ahead and mark Rena off the list. So by now, Fred has murdered Anne, Rose has murdered Charmaine, Heather West, Heather Ann. She was the first of the 8 children who tried to reach out for help. She confided in a close friend at school. The friend then reached out to the school authorities, who reached out to the local law enforcement. The police were questioned, and then Fred and Rose Heather West was the first of the 8 children who tried to reach out for help. She confided in a close friend, and then that friend then sought out the proper outlet, the proper person, and word made its way to the local authorities. The police questioned Fred and Rose, and the couple denied any abuse, sexual, physical, verbal, otherwise. They said that Heather was a liar. And the police said, thank you for your time, and just left. They never even stepped foot in the house. It's crazy to me looking back, but after that, Heather was never seen alive again. So Anna Marie, a lot of my research, or the media's best parts, came from her testimony. And she testified that, it almost became a joke in the West household. Not a good joke, but they would joke about it like it was hilarious that, keep your mouth shut or you'll end up like your sister. Open your mouth and you'll end up in the backyard like your sister Heather. So, it worked for most of the children. They were terrified. They knew what they meant. But, they kept quiet because they were so scared and they didn't want to end up in the backyard like their sister. But, there was one extraordinarily brave little girl. She was 13 at the time. And another one of the biological West children, Louise. Now, Louise was very brave, but I think also part of her seeking out the help the way she did, or kind of being the saving grace to this family, is I think she reached a point of just snapping. So Fred had, recently begun a sexual relationship with Louise. It was not consensual, as him and Rose try to claim their relationships with their parents were. He was raping Louise. Louise, the first time she was raped by her father, her siblings found her on the floor, crying and bleeding. She told them what happened. Rose was not home when this happened. When she did get home, Louise and her siblings approached Rose, their mother, to let them know what had happened, and Rose told Louise that she must have been asking for it. While Rose, wasn't present for that first rape, she didn't miss any after that. She was present each and every time that Fred raped Louise after that first time, and would even videotape it from time to time. Louise is, obviously depressed. She's desperate. She's terrified. I can't imagine living with what any of these children went through, but especially Louise. So she confided in one of her friends that what was happening to her. I just think that the weight of it, she couldn't handle it anymore. And maybe deep down she knew that, she of course knew what could happen to her if Fred and Rose found out. She would end up, like her sister. And I think that just having it off her chest, and even considering her death could be the outcome, it would be a way out. The friend's mother went to the police. She went with she gave an anonymous tip. She asked to be left anonymous. The police finally came, and the police finally came, and this is what really got the ball running. Fred was arrested first, then Rose, and this event with Louise is what, at least was the first step to bringing peace to, the children that were left in the West household, and stopping them from being able to torture, rape, and murder any other young women in this small town. The subtopic that I chose was nature versus nurture. I chose my serial killers before I chose my subtopic, and in my case anyway, that worked out perfectly, because once I had studied Fred and Rose, and then I saw the list of the subtopics, I knew this was the one I had to do. I knew it was perfect. So here's a few of the reasons why, and I think with a lot of the nature versus nurture debate, this ends up being the case, is that, how do you definitively say one or the other? You can find examples for each one, but I'll talk for a bit about what I think kind of can fit into each of those columns for Fred and Rose, and nature versus nurture is perfect for them because there are so many things to go in each of these columns. So the first thing is that Fred and Rose both came from extremely abusive households, and a lot of people grow up in abusive households, but I think the length and the type and the depth of the abuse that these two endured, I think it is more rare, and the fact that they both endured it, such similar types of abuse, and walked away with the same feelings and thoughts on that type of abuse and how it wasn't abuse at all, I think that's interesting. The next thing that I found and that I thought of when looking at nature versus nurture is there were possible injuries and traumas for both of them. So Fred, like Rose, had a low IQ. With Rose, it's an assumption. It's looking back at how classmates perceived her, how, her nickname, and just difficulties that she had. But with Fred, we know that his IQ was 84, which is low. But when he was 17 years old, he had a terrible motorcycle accident where he did suffer a head injury. And this is on top of already having a lowish IQ. Fred, his friends and family did say to him, amongst each other, even before Fred became serial killer Fred, that they noticed such a shift and a change in his personality after this accident, that he just became a different person entirely. His mannerisms, his personality, everything about him changed. So to add on to that, he 2 years later had another accident. He was having a verbal disagreement with a man. This verbal disagreement turned into a physical altercation, and the man threw Fred from a second-story balcony. And again, Fred hit his head and experienced traumatic head injury. So as I stated with Rose, this would fall into the nurture column. I stated that she endured some pretty awful, relentless bullying for a long time. I mean, it was from day one until the end. She was bullied for how slow she was, for her weight, for her body, for how crazy her parents were. Kids at school knew that. It was relentless. There was no escape for her, and there was no escape until she met Fred. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, Rose's mother underwent electroshock therapy while she was pregnant, and throughout the pregnancy multiple times. So it's hard for me to believe that this didn't have some sort of adverse effect on an unborn child. So that would fall into the nature column, because was there something that happened during those therapy sessions and Rose in your utero that caused something to happen in her brain, or that would contribute to Rose becoming who she became. So I do think it is a combination of both. Again, there's no way to know definitively which one it is, but they're a perfect couple to ponder the nature versus nurture question, because there is so many things you can put in each column, the nature column or the nurture column, for both of them. I think that there are definitely biological factors. Fred's multiple head injuries, what possibly happened to Rose in utero, but there's no denying that what these two people endured throughout their childhood, there's no doubt in my mind that played, possibly, again, no way to know, the biggest part in them becoming who they did. So that's the story of Fred and Rose West. There's a lot I had to leave out. There's a lot that I had to leave out. Believe it or not, specifics about other children, stories from other victims, but it's a lot. If I would have tried to include it all, this would have been a 2 or 3 hour